the ghostly hitchhiker. Late at night, I was hauling a load through the desolate backroads of rural Georgia. My only company was the hum of my engine and the soft crackling of my CB radio. The road was dark, lined with thick trees that cast eerie shadows. I had driven this route countless times, but tonight, something felt off. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught sight of a figure standing by the roadside, thumb extended in the universal sign for a hitchhiker. I was a cautious man, but seeing the lone woman, drenched from the sudden downpour, stirred my compassion. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a lift?" I asked. The woman nodded, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She climbed into the cab, shivering. "Thank you," she whispered. I cranked up the heat and handed her a blanket from the back seat. "What's your name?" "Emily," she said, her voice barely audible. As I drove, I tried to make small talk, but she remained mostly silent, staring out the window. Something about her unnerved me, but I brushed it off as fatigue. After a few miles, she finally spoke. "Can you take me to the old Jenkins farmhouse?" The name sent a chill down my spine. The Jenkins farmhouse had been abandoned for years, ever since the tragic fire that killed the entire Jenkins family. Rumors claimed it was haunted, but I didn't believe in such things. "Are you sure?" I asked, glancing at her. She nodded, her eyes filled with a strange, distant sorrow. I reluctantly agreed, figuring I could drop her off and be on my way quickly. We arrived at the decrepit farmhouse, its charred remains looming in the darkness. Emily turned to me, her eyes suddenly hollow and cold. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before I could respond, she vanished, literally disappeared, leaving the blanket behind. My heart pounded as I stared at the empty seat. I wasn't imagining this. I had felt her presence, heard her voice. Panic set in, and I sped away, not stopping until I reached the next town. At a truck stop, I shared my experience with the locals. Their faces went pale. "You met Emily Jenkins," one old-timer said. "She's been dead for 50 years. Died in that fire with her family. They say she haunts that road, looking for a way home." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice. The next time I drove that route, I made sure never to stop, no matter what. The Phantom Convoy. I was on a long haul through the remote stretches of Nevada, the vast desert landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. The isolation was both comforting and eerie. The CB radio crackled intermittently, but for the most part, it was just me and the road. Around midnight, I spotted a convoy of trucks up ahead. Their lights twinkled in the distance like a string of stars. Relieved at the prospect of some company, I accelerated to catch up. As I drew nearer, something seemed off. The trucks were old, really old, like relics from the 1940s. Their paint was faded, and the trailers bore logos of companies long out of business. I pulled up alongside the lead truck and glanced over. The driver, a gaunt man in a tattered uniform, stared straight ahead, his eyes blank and lifeless. I honked, but he didn't react. None of the drivers did. They all looked like ghosts, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on the road. A shiver ran down my spine. I slowed down, letting the convoy move ahead. The CB radio crackled to life, and a voice, distorted and faint, echoed through the cab. "Turn back." I grabbed the mic. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, "Turn back, or join us." My heart raced. I glanced at the convoy again. They were disappearing into the distance, their taillights fading into the night. I took a deep breath and decided to follow them, curiosity overpowering my fear. The convoy led me off the main road onto a narrow, winding path. The landscape grew more desolate, the air colder. Finally, they came to a stop in front of an old, abandoned truck stop. The buildings were crumbling, the windows shattered. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I parked and stepped out, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The trucks were gone, vanished. Only my rig remained. The radio crackled again. "Welcome." I spun around, but there was no one there. The wind howled through the empty buildings, carrying with it whispers of the past. I climbed back into my truck, heart pounding, and floored it out of there. Back on the main road, I radioed for any nearby truckers, desperate to hear another human voice. A familiar voice responded, one I'd spoken to many times on these lonely stretches. "You saw the convoy, didn't you?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, my voice trembling. "Those trucks were part of a supply line during World War II. They disappeared without a trace. Some say they're cursed, doomed to drive the roads forever. You're lucky you turned back." I didn't feel lucky. I felt haunted. From that night on, every time I saw a convoy in the distance, I wondered if it was them, the phantom truckers, still searching for their final destination. The desert diner. I was driving through the Arizona desert, the sun setting in a blaze of red and orange. The landscape was barren, nothing but sand and rocks for miles. I'd been on the road for hours and was in desperate need of a break. As if by magic, a neon sign appeared on the horizon. Desert Diner, open 24 hours. I pulled in, grateful for the respite. The diner was a relic from another era, its chrome exterior gleaming in the twilight. Inside, it was empty except for a lone waitress behind the counter. She was a striking woman, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Evening, stranger," she said with a smile. "What can I get you?" I ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, taking a seat by the window. The coffee was strong, the pie delicious. As I ate, I noticed old photographs on the walls, depicting the diner in its heyday. The same waitress was in many of them, looking exactly as she did now. "Must be your mother," I said when she refilled my coffee. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Something like that." I finished my meal and paid, leaving a generous tip. As I stepped outside, the air had turned frigid, a stark contrast to the earlier heat. I shrugged it off and climbed back into my truck. Turning the key, I glanced back at the diner. It was gone. The lot was empty. The neon sign vanished. I blinked, sure I was imagining things. I got out and walked around, searching for any sign of the building. Nothing. Just an old, faded signpost and a few scattered pieces of debris. Panic set in. I radioed for any nearby truckers, but there was no response. I was completely alone. I drove on, my mind racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? A few miles down the road, I saw lights ahead. Another trucker was pulled over, fixing a flat. I stopped to help, grateful for the company. "Did you see the diner back there?" I asked. He looked at me, confused. "What diner?" "The desert diner. It was right off the road." His face paled. "There hasn't been a diner there for 50 years. It burned down in the 60s, killed everyone inside." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But I was just there. I talked to the waitress." "She's the one who died in the fire," he said quietly. "They say she still serves weary travelers, trying to make up for not being able to save anyone." I didn't know what to say. The memory of her smile, her eyes, haunted me. From that night on, I avoided that stretch of road, not wanting to encounter the desert diner or its ghostly waitress ever again.